Welcome and thank you for joining us today. This is Forging Ahead, the EU-AU partnership in a changing global landscape. Your moderator today is Jana de Kluiver, Research Officer, Africa in the World, ISS Pretoria. Please keep your microphones and cameras turned off until we reach the question and answer portion for today's event. The question and answer session will be conducted using both the chat function and the raise hand function on your Zoom application. To access the chat function, kindly scroll to the bottom of your Zoom application, click on the chat button, and a chat box will appear. Should you wish to raise your hand, kindly click on the reactions button to access the raise hand function. During the question and answer session, the moderator will acknowledge you, and you will have to unmute your own microphone and turn your own camera on to make your comment or ask your question. Please note that we will evaluate this event with an online poll for our online audience. The evaluation is completely anonymous, and it helps us to present better events in future. Kindly do take a moment to complete it. It'll be launched following the presentations portion for today's event. As we wait for the final participants to connect their audio, we kindly remind you to please keep your microphones muted and your cameras turned off until we reach the Q&A portion for today. Please also note that since this is a public event being broadcast live on YouTube, Chatham House rule does not apply. This is Forging Ahead, the EU-AU partnership in a changing global landscape. Jana, you have the floor.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today at this very topical event. For now, I'll be handing over to Priyal to start with opening remarks. I hope you have a wonderful and very informative session.
Excellencies, colleagues, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this morning's joint seminar between the ISS and the Embassy of Spain in South Africa, focusing on the strategic partnership between the European Union and the African Union in a changing global landscape. My name is Priyal Singh. I'm a senior researcher in the Institute's Africa in the World program. And I'd like to express my gratitude, firstly, to His Excellency, Mr. Raimundo Rubio, Ambassador of Spain in South Africa, as well as our expert panelists from the ISS and the European Council on Foreign Relations, most of whom have traveled a great distance to engage with us in this discussion. At the ISS, we recognize that these kinds of engagements that spur on regular critical reflections and exchange on Africa's place in the world are absolutely vital. The collective engagements of African states with major international peace, security, and development partners need to be more consistently appraised in order to inform more productive and mutually beneficial relationships. And the strategic partnership between the African Union and the European Union perhaps best represents this kind of deep, sophisticated, and complex interinstitutional interaction that is needed for countries in the global north and the global south to work toward the achievement of shared peace, security, and developmental priorities. Of course, it goes without saying that despite growing interinstitutional linkages to regularly interface on common concerns, the world in 2023 is unfortunately one that even the most optimistic among us will admit presents challenges that may appear to be insurmountable. In fact, we seem to be very much at an inflection point in the evolution of the international order. Many critically important global institutions are facing a legitimacy and credibility crisis. Populist politics are taking root in many of the world's major powers, and global geopolitical competition and rivalry is clearly intensifying amongst major world powers over competing world views on a new, emergent, potentially multipolar world order. So this is clearly a volatile and uncertain international environment, and one that requires concerted efforts toward building consensus on the most pressing issues of our time, particularly as these concern very real existential crises that are looming on our immediate horizon. But in this world, and against the experiences of the last few years, we must recognize that the only way out of disaster and toward a sustainable shared future is to dialogue more. We need to dialogue more regularly, more meaningfully, more critically, and we need to ensure that this leads to more informed, effective, and just global policymaking. Perhaps most importantly, we require bold and decisive policymaking on issues from climate change and the just transition to migration and the structure of the international order, or the structure of the international institutional order, to be much more nimble, adaptive, and reflexive. And of course, we need the political will and consensus amongst the leaders from Brussels to Addis Ababa to oversee effective implementation of these policies. And that is precisely why we are here today, this morning, to focus on some of the critical dimensions of engagements between the EU and the AU, which of course go on to inform European and African international relations that have very real and direct impact on shared peace, security, and developmental concerns. Excellencies, colleagues, and of course our online audience, I once again thank you and welcome you to the ISS. We have two excellent panel discussions that will soon begin and will be moderated by my colleague Jana, who I must also thank for basically just pulling all of this together. And before we begin, I would very much like to welcome our partner and co-convener of this event, Ambassador Raimundo Rubio, to the podium. Excellency, the floor is yours. Thank you.
I will try to be brief. Thank you very much, Prial, and thank you to the ESFR and the ISS for coming together today. To quote Bogart at the end of Casablanca, I hope this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship, because we need that communication that Prial was talking about. And I think that ISS is an outstanding think tank, an outstanding machine of thinking Africa. And the ECFR, as I heard Theo say yesterday, maybe a little bit too ambitiously, is the engine of European foreign policy. At least the ideas engine. Let me start by apologizing for the lack of a European flag that I just noticed. There should be a European flag. I am assuming this is the embassy's fault. I apologize for that, because this event is circumscribed. I'm glad that Sandra Kramer couldn't come, because she would be giving me an earful, the European ambassador, for not having the European flag. It should be there. Let's all imagine it's there. My apologies. This event is part of a series of events that Spain has organized as a result of our rotating presidency of the European Union for the 6 months, second half of this year until the end of the year. Spain holds the rotating presidency of the Council. So, why are we here? Trying to be brief. Almost 2 years ago, Russia invaded Ukraine, and we were all, in the subsequent vote in the United Nations, I would say surprised. Maybe we shouldn't have been surprised, but we were surprised by the fact that about half African countries did not vote with us, even though we share with all African countries, as far as I know, or most of it. Actually, there's a couple. We share a common view of the value of human rights, international law, the respect for borders, etc., which is enshrined in the African Union own constitutional documents. So, what gives? What was amiss? Prial touched upon it. It's a new international order, and that new international order, that change, the main change is that the rules of the international order, the rules that govern the rules-based international order, for the first time since the end of World War II, are being disputed. It's not that Africa, at least in my opinion, is against a rules-based international order. It's the rules that govern that rules-based international order that, according to many African countries, need changes. Europe, as you know, has a different view. We do think that those rules have served the international community very well, and that they need tweaking, but not overhauling. So in the end, it's a matter of degree. But the way in that that degree is seen differently, and the way in that contrast between Europe and Africa was starkly shown at the vote in the European Union, in the United Nations, sorry, I think surprised most of us. So the European Union scrambled to see what's wrong with our relationship with Africa. We are the number one investor, number one trade partner, number one development cooperation partner, security partner. We are number one partner in all spheres. So how come we cannot count on them to be our partner in this war that affects us directly? In fact, the question came into focus starkly after that vote, but that is a question that we've been asking ourselves for a long time in the European Union. We tried to forge a partnership with the African Union that never really becomes a partnership as strong as we would like it to be. Africa has new options. We're not the only game in town. We never were the only game in town, but increasingly other actors, China most saliently, but also India, Turkey, the Gulf monarchies, and others are present in Africa. So we need to make a value proposition. And we've been trying to do that for the last, I would say decades, but at least for the last 10 years or 15 years with the African Union. It's a very difficult dialogue because in my personal experience, in my time as Director General of Africa in Spain for 4 years, it's a dialogue that we never seem to hit the sweet spot. We're either given too much or too little. The African Union perceives the European Union alternatively as overbearing or under-delivering, or maybe both at the same time. And this is a problem because this is not what we want to do. We don't want to dictate to the African Union. We want to respond to the African Union needs, and we've stated that many times, and we're happy to do that. That is what we seek. But we simply cannot, or we struggle to find that sweet spot. And the idea of behind this seminar today was to try to bring together, and with this I close, going back to the beginning of my supposedly brief intervention, to bring together the brains, some of the, in my opinion, best brains in thinking Africa and in thinking Europe, to see what ideas they can come up with, to point out where I've been wrong. In just 5 minutes, I'm sure there's many things some of you will disagree with, and to ideally forge a path ahead, as the title of the seminar tries to capture. It's not enough that we discuss our positions. The main idea is that we arrive at a common view, or at least the embryo of a future common view of how Africa and Europe can walk together and work together, because ignoring each other is not an option. It really is not an option. It never was, but now more than ever, it isn't an option. So I'll close with that, and I'm looking forward to hearing all the panelists. And again, thank you to the ISS for hosting us today.
Thank you very much, Ambassador and Priyal, for contextualizing this problem and really bringing to our attention how pertinent it is to have these conversations that we are privileged enough to have today. Our panels will delve into critical topics ranging from migration and peace to climate change and the evolving global landscape. As we embark on this journey of exploration, I encourage each of you to actively engage in the dialogue. The seminar is not just about the perspective shared by our distinguished panelists. It's also about fostering interactive exchanges of ideas. Each panel will be followed by a Q&A discussion after our panelists have presented. I encourage our online audience to also pop their questions in the chat box. We will get around to them as quickly as possible. I encourage you to engage throughout the session within the chat box for our online audience. Additionally, kindly be aware, as Richard has pointed out, this event will be live streamed. Consequently, Chatham House rule does not apply. As we navigate through the intricacies of the EU-AU partnership, it is imperative to recognize the dynamic nature of the challenges before us. The first panel will scrutinize the future of this partnership, with a spotlight on migration governance, climate resilience, and the promotion of peace and security. These interconnected elements play a pivotal role in shaping the collaboration between the EU and the AU. The seminar serves as a platform to not only dissect these complex issues, but also to envision a path forward that fosters collaboration, understanding, and shared progress. I would like to invite our first three panelists to come join us on the stage. Dr. Margaret Monyani. She is a senior migration researcher here at the ISS. Also, Dhesigen Naidoo, Senior Research Associate, Climate Risk and Human Security Program here at the Institute for Security Studies, as well as Ameer Chughtai, researcher for the Africa Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Please take note to optimize our time. You may join us on stage as well. To optimize our time, the professional profiles of all of our wonderful panelists can be found at the back of your program. And that being said, I'd like to welcome to the podium, if you'd like, otherwise you could remain seated as well, Dr. Monyani, that will take us to the future of the EU-AU partnership and how we could possibly be building a consensus on migration and governance. Thank you.
I'll bring it to you.
So, Excellencies and colleagues and the online audience, good morning. Oh, good morning. It's not a good morning. So, thank you for the opportunity, Jana, to speak about this, of course, very topical issue on the future of the EU-AU partnership, especially on migration governance. So I want to preempt and say there's nothing new that I'm going to say here. I just want to repeat all what we know. That now that we are in a group, we can talk about it because we all read separately. But now we are here, we have a chance that we are all in this room, now we can discuss. So in an era where international migration has become a central issue, understanding the relationship between EU and AU is crucial than ever. This partnership, rich in history, complexity, holds the potential to redefine approaches to migration, impacting millions of lives. We know that migration is inherently a transnational phenomena, a reality of, and especially I always like to say that migration is what defines us as Africa. If there is an African in this room, they'll tell you they moved from this point to this other point. So, which then, while that is the case, it presents also unique challenges and opportunities for both continents, that the EU and the AU. So as we witness a surge in migration due to varying factors like economic disparities, conflict, environmental changes, the need for effective governance becomes paramount. The EU, with its advanced economic landscape, and the AU, rich in cultural and human resources, stands at crossroads. So there is their collaboration could set a precedent for migration policies globally. So if I were to make a quick point on migration trends, and this we know very well, African migration has been on a steady upward trajectory for the past 2 decades. The record level of over 40 million African migrants represents a 30% increase from 2010. So given the continuing strong push factors, that trend can be expected to continue actually. So while often unrecognized, I don't think so in this room, we know that most African migration occurs within the continent as migrants seek employment opportunities in the neighboring regional economic hubs. And the southern part of Africa is a very good case study of this. Most of the South Africans, when we say from Zimbabwe, or 80 or 90% of them moved for economic reasons. But we have those from the Horn, it's because of conflict. Large flows are because of the conflicts. 80% of African migrants do not have an interest in leaving the continent. Africa accounts for only 14% of the global migration population, compared to 41% from Asia and 24% from Europe. But then when there's this perception that there is this looming, numbers of African migrants moving to the EU, to the north, why is that the case? The case I could attribute it to media. You know how the media can do it. The media, in the sense that we have migrants who are moving to Europe to study, to work, to do many other things, to visit. tourists. They are never shown on TV. We only know those ones on the boats and the ones that are captured and the image replicated over in many channels, which makes it look like it's a huge problem. So when it comes to, let me now move to the EU-Africa partnership. Of course, it dates back, now it's at the institutional normative level, would say since 2007 up to now, more than 2 decades. So, but when it comes to this partnership, contrary to the EU, which prioritizes migration, African governance, this is I'm of the opinion that African governments often place migration lower on their national policy agendas. So the migration policy in many African countries, especially those that are points of origin or transit for migrants, is heavily influenced by Europe and international organizations. So interest in national migration governance started gaining traction around 2005 in Africa with the development of the migration policy framework for Africa. Since then, the AU and its member states have been working on creating continent-wide policies, and we have the Freedom of Movement Protocol, which we were at the platform discussing how can we ratify this, because since 2018, 5 years on, only 4 ratifications. They have until 2028. I don't know, I'm not a legal expert. I don't know what happens after that if we lapse, the period lapses. And then you ask yourself that in the last 5 years, again, there has been intensified bilateral agreements regarding migration on the continent. And actually, according to the African Development Bank report, it shows that as of now, at least 53% of Africans can move to the neighboring countries or another country in Africa, either visa-free or they get a visa on arrival. So there is that intensification of bilateral agreements. You see regional economic communities like ECOWAS and the EAC have become like those typical ideal forms of regional integration. So if you were to do the maths, EAC is 9 countries. ECOWAS is 15. Those are like 23 thereabout. Then you wonder, why were we not getting the 15 that we need for the ratification of the FPM? So the migration agenda in Africa gained wide attention in Africa following the initiation of the Africa-EU partnership in 2007. That is what I mentioned, and particularly after the 2015 Valletta summit. So post-Valletta, the EU adopted a more forceful migration policy using a combination of persuasive and also coercive methods to encourage African countries to limit or halt migration towards Europe. Various means, we saw that through including financial incentives, partnership in aid, development, peace, security, governance, and all that were aligned to serve the migration agenda. So, but when you look at this partnership, we see so the EU's influence in African migration matters is significant and widespread, largely due to the European Union Trust Fund for Africa, which was established by, not long ago. So, but when we look at this, we see dialogues after 2007, 2015, and even in 2020, there's the new pact. In 2022, there was the renewed EU-Africa partnership in February. But then what is the nature of this partnership as it is? There is the divergence and varying perspectives on migration, like I've mentioned. From the European perspective, Africa is often seen primarily as a source of migrants, which necessitates policies focused on border control and development. This viewpoint, of course, has particularly intensified during the 2015, I don't want to call it migration crisis. As a migration scholar, I feel uneasy to call it a crisis because those people were moving from conflict-induced, it was a conflict-induced displacement, which heightened European fears about uncontrolled migration. So there have been attempts to foster mutual understanding, such as in 2017 summit in Abidjan, the 22 AU-EU partnership renewal, but then there still remains persistent gaps in understanding the dynamics and internal problems specific to each continent. So this misunderstanding is compounded by the diverse goals within the EU and AU. So the EU's approach is further complicated by individual member states having their own foreign policies towards African countries. This leads to a preference for bilateral relations and mobility partnership, with individual African states rather than a unified EU approach. So and on the other side, the AU's weaker institutional structure exacerbates this issue with no cohesive regional agreement or cooperation policy, especially in the northern part of Africa. There is also the political difference. I've already mentioned the EU primarily focuses on preventing irregular migration and securing its borders. So the notion of linking migration with security has been prominent in the EU, in Europe since the 1990s, and it continues to be the case. African countries often prefer European action that addresses structural causes and redirects funds towards local economic stimulation projects. So you see, one is on border control, the other is on development and creating legal pathways. So that divergent also is what has defined this partnership for a while. And of course, the issue of conditionality. The EU has increasingly used migration management as a condition for its agreements with African countries. But then we see while there has been this progress, there is limited success. If you ask me, why is that the case? I think there is the issue in terms of grounding in reality. Like if we are coming from a point that we assume that there are so many migrants from Africa that are moving to Europe. So that's not the reality. So the current EU-Africa partnership fails to accurately reflect on the ground realities and struggles with implementation issues, particularly in return and readmission policies since the Valletta Declaration in 2015. So there is need to ground in reality in this, and that's we also see that EU funding prioritizes short-term solutions like criminal justice, border control, over long-term strategy-driven migration governance in Africa. If I may just give some statistics, in the Sahel, there was over €1 billion, some 4 or 5 countries that were invested since 2015. But research shows that most projects were designed to restrict and discourage irregular migration. And that portion of money that went to discouraging irregular migration through migration containment and control was 50%, 55%. Raising awareness about dangers of irregular migration, 4%. And implementing policy reforms for returns, 25%. And improving the identification of countries' nationals, 13%. Only a meager 3% of the budget is allocated to developing safe and regular routes. I'm just quoting a study here. So that tells you whatever. There is the issue of risk and benefits. Many African countries, the risk of cooperating with the EU on issues like return and readmission outweigh their financial benefits. The other way, I was in Ethiopia. I think there were few Ethiopians that were brought back. I was reading about this case where in 2015, when the EU was trying to experiment with the returns, they spoke to Ethiopia, can we bring back? And they say, okay, but our Ethiopians need to assent to this. So the EU finds some 53 Ethiopians who are willing to come back home. But then it takes a lot of time because then the Ethiopian government needs to hand them documents, which they don't do on time because they're dragging their feet. So by the time they agree to give them the documents, only 20 of them out of 53 are still on board. And what does Ethiopia say? It actually blames the EU for losing the other ones. So the question of legal pathways, and I think this is where I will stop, legal pathways. Despite EU's promises, substantial legal migration pathways to Europe, such as visa facilitation, quicker family reunification, and increased labor migration remain underdeveloped. And this is a bigger issue. But again, we see those who say legal migration avenues are less effective as incentives to reduce irregular migration in Africa. We see the EU's new Pact on Migration and Asylum, the revised Blue Card Directive targeting highly skilled workers. Yet, many of those who use irregular channels are not highly skilled workers. So if you are dealing with irregular migrants who are on the boats, that not necessarily, I'm not saying all of them are not. If you go and check how many have degrees, maybe 2 or 3. So, but the question is, when we are talking about legal pathways, I know I'm already over time. The question is, if we are creating, say, the issue of visas, making visas accessible to those who qualify, then the question is, visas for whom? Who benefits from these pathways? That's also the question we need to ask ourselves. Is it officials, investors, landed people like myself? I mean, skilled or unskilled workers. How many might benefit compared to the risk of supporting migrant return? Do these routes favor wealthier families who can meet requirements more easily? That's the question. Is there adequate investment in Africa to develop skills required in Europe? So these are just some of the many questions. It's not just one thing to point out there generally, broadly, that we need legal pathways. There is very nitty-gritty and granular details that we need to go into to make the EU partnership workable. I think I would have to stop there. I had more to say, but for now, let me stop there to allow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Monyani. Honestly, I could sit here all day and listen to your insights with regards to this. And I sincerely encourage everyone to, during the Q&A and also afterwards, engage on these pertinent questions that you pose at the end, because I do think this is something that necessitates a deeper conversation. I would like to hand over to our next speaker, Dhesigen Naidoo, who will be talking about EU-AU collaboration in addressing climate change and ultimately ensuring a just transition. I look forward to hearing from you, Des. Sorry.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you. Today is International Palestine Day, and the introductory notes that have happened this morning, it is the first gathering I've been to in the last 6 weeks that hasn't talked about the war in Gaza. And I'm wondering what that says. I'll return to that shortly. Ambassador, you talked about the sweet spot, the elusive sweet spot. And I can assure you that we're all seeking it. Like you and many other European colleagues are astounded by some of the positions that are being expressed on this continent about the Ukraine, about Gaza, about some other things in the world. Please be assured that we are equally mesmerized by the positions that Europe has taken on these issues. So we are clearly looking at the world with very different lenses. You said that the current world order needs a little tweak to be better. Some of us think that a radical overhaul is the only way in which we are going to go forward as a genuinely harmonious global community. So you are right. We need to find the spaces where we can converge. Because if we don't, we have the very real risk of going even further apart. I should also point out to you that the diversity of opinion is not restricted between Europe or the global north and Africa and the global south. Within the global south, there is the split as well. I mean, South Africa is quite divided on all of these issues. And so the thing is, can we find that thing that helps to bring us a little bit closer together? And my proposition to you is that maybe we have such an instrument in the form of climate change. Because as it happens, we are collectively agreed that this is an existential crisis. We are collectively agreed on the nature of the emergency. We largely agree on what should be done. The thing we're not agreeing on is who should do it, in particular, who should pay for it, and how quickly it should happen. So let's talk to these issues in the context of the EU relationship, which, as it happens in the climate change domain, is a very vibrant one, a very positive one, and one that has more bridges than it has divides. So we're going to go into COP in a couple of days' time. It's literally that. And yes, all of the other things that are happening in the world will have a large impact in how we discuss what we need to discuss. We're also going to be engaging the issue around the availability of resources in a world that has taken a predominantly security-first paradigm. And the costs of that are absolutely immense. That in many ways, we are kicking the climate can down the road to a more and more difficult pathway, precisely because we can't get ourselves converge on some of the other issues that we need to deal with. So what are these differences inside climate change between Europe and Africa that we need to engage? Firstly, is the issue of pathways. Europe is talking about a decarbonization agenda as the headline, as the very dominant headline. For some countries in Africa, that clearly is an important thing to do. South Africa is one of those. But for Africa as a whole, the concept of decarbonization is almost bizarre. Low carbon development, yes, but decarbonization? For a continent that is contributing 4% of the greenhouse gases to the global budget, which is even less than the global military complex, which contributes 5.5% on its own. It's the wrong conversation. The second thing is about the pace of moving to a low carbon world. By and large, this is a poor continent. It depends very heavily on the aspirations expressed in Agenda 2063. And yes, a climate resilient Agenda 2063 to get to a level of development with fundamental pillars like energy security in order for us to secure meeting the basic needs of the people on this continent. And we're not talking about wealth indices here. We're talking about basic needs. And the world depends on us getting this right. Because if Africa, firstly, does not realize a reasonable level of development, the numbers that Margaret is currently talking about will be pittance. If Africa does not manage to organize to get a demographic dividend from a very youthful profile of population on this continent, the world as a whole will inherit the demographic burden. It won't just be Africa. So we have to have a reasonableness around how we engage these issues. And then in the midst of all that is to work out what a just transition means. Now, we've all accepted this terminology. South Africa can lay claim to making the concept more popular than it was before, at this time at COP26, but it is now a genuinely global context. And all these elements of justice, including the issues of how we deal with migration, including the issues on development relationships, not just climate, finance moving across, around engaging this global financial system that we think is incredibly unjust, are all parts of that fabric. Now, let me be candid. The EU has been a very good partner around the things that we want to do. An excellent one, actually. So some examples will be the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. And South Africa is the first on this continent that has one. It's been closely followed elsewhere by Vietnam, Indonesia. There are about 30 countries in the world, including 5 on the African continent, who want to move into that frame. And it makes a lot of sense. The drivers are different in different places. So the African driver around a Just Energy Transition Partnership is much more about energy security than it is about decarbonization, where the goal still is climate resilient energy on the system. Some flow of funds have happened. We're not terribly happy about the flow of funds being predominantly in the form of loans, a small percentage of which is concessional and much less available for grants. But, you know, people start where they are, and then we build that up to where we want to go. So on the JETPs, and we'll talk a lot more about JETPs at COP28, there is a movement that I think there's a genuine appreciation on both sides. The other area one can point to where the cooperation has been really good is around developing African agency and climate governance. And there are various instruments that have been used and big gestures that have been made. I mean, the African Union genuinely appreciated the participation of the European Union in the first African Climate Summit that was ever held, and that was in September this year. These are very good signals around the system. The EU Climate Dialogues project is helping us to build capacities all over this continent, including South Africa. The engagements that we're having with various European partners under the banner of climate change is generally quite positive, unless we start talking about adaptation finance in particular. Then we have a few difficulties in that discussion. But the movement is something that is genuinely appreciated. It is also appreciated that we are dealing with a Europe that is listening much more than it did before. Not just about the needs of this continent, but the ideas that this continent has about how the whole world can change. Because I'm sure it is clear to you that there aren't too many candidates in the world that offer a greenfield site for a low carbon economy. This is a continent that by and large does not have to retrofit. This is a continent that can organize itself into the design of climate sensitive development and be the first implementer in the world. We're continuously surprised that people are not excited by this concept. I think you should be. I really think you should. We want to have bigger wind farms and solar farms than Spain and supply you with some of that energy at a discounted rate because you're our friend. So I think that there's a different conversation that we should organize ourselves into. And if we do, I think we'll be finding that sweet spot fairly quickly. So some of the sticky points around this, because, we've had to unpack this thing about what holds people where they are. One of the things is that we are possibly on the brink of a kind of multipolarity in the world that potentially is going to be quite destructive. Now, of course, it's possible to have multipolarity in the world that is extremely positive. But some of the precipitants catalyzing that discussion currently are not encouraged. We're doing it on the basis of our positions on different wars that are happening around the world right now, about being disgruntled with a rules base in the system. And I'll return to this issue about tweaks versus overhaul. I mean, Africa has had the experience of leading a debate in the UN Security Council around issues of climate security. You will know this well. And it didn't pass through, as many things don't pass through the UN Security Council, because the UN Security Council is a highly divided organ, in my view. And one of the critiques that were put out by one of the developing countries that actually opposed that resolution was that, how can you do this in an institution that has such a low democratic index? And that's something we really need to think about. So Ambassador, the tweaks won't be good enough unless they're very clever tweaks. The major overhaul is what we are looking for. So let me round up and talk about the road forward, COP28 and the road ahead. The road ahead for the global community, the road ahead for specific relations like the AU-EU, and in fact, the many bilateral. Now, I don't want to use the fear factor too much, but I have it with a strong citation. It was Thabo Mbeki who wrote about the Africans are coming. And the citation he used was that the West tends to take notice when they are threatened by certain things. And maybe one of the things that Africa doesn't do well enough is it doesn't threaten anybody. I don't know if we know how to do that. But here's a threat for everybody around climate change. If Africa is forced to, and Africa currently sits on a more than $10 trillion asset in the form of coal and gas and oil. If it is forced to, if there is no other option to keep poverty away and to come anywhere close to the aspirations of 2063, then Africa will be forced to use that fossil fuel asset. If it does, the current projection is that Africa, in a generally lower carbon world worldwide, will become a 40% contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And if that happens, we will no longer be talking about 1.5 or 2.7 or 3.2, because these are the big numbers we're talking about now for very specific reasons, we'll be talking about +5 or +6 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And if that happens, the collective catastrophe will be unbelievable. But there's enough that's telling us that there is some measure of appreciation of this. And with that appreciation, we hope to get the right kind of signals in these multilateral negotiations that will take us forward. So the big things we're looking for at COP28, and we're hoping that our European friends will help us to get this. One is that we have to begin the discussion of beyond $100 billion. Now, at the Petersburg Dialogue earlier this year, the European Union made it quite clear that this is going to be realized this year, and they're going to announce the $100 billion at COP28. I hope that happens. We trust that this will be the case. But we now need to talk about the $1.5 trillion beyond that per year that we need in the developing world around the assistance to move things forward. The second thing that we want to hear a lot more about are the signals associated with the global goal on adaptation. Now, the climate-related disaster map in the world is one, pervasive. There is no place in the world that is immune from it. Two, much more intense than it ever was before. And three, the regularity is absolutely alarming. We are now seeing incredible phenomena where storms, instead of dying out completely when they hit the land, are going back into the ocean and re-energizing. We have two examples of that recently. One is Cyclone Freddy, which went back out into the channel and came back into Malawi. We have Storm Daniel that should have dissipated in Greece, but then crossed the Mediterranean and completely smashed Libya and Derna. So we're dealing with these incredible phenomena, which means that if we don't deal adequately around funding the global goal on adaptation, we are going to be unstuck collectively. The third signal that we're looking for is around loss and damage. Because the reality is those places in the world that can least afford it are having to deal with the loss and damage. And we need much stronger signals around how we can hold hands together to get over those bumps. And then maybe the last thing is to organize for better rules bases on the spirit in which some of the instruments are already being used. One of those examples, maybe the biggest one, is Article 6, and it's the carbon markets. The carbon markets already have very difficult examples in some parts of the world, including our neighbors in Mozambique, where essentially they're taking people, indigenous people who've been on the land for centuries, out of that land to preserve an asset to allow certain other players to continue polluting. And clearly this can't work. Colleagues, there's a lot more to talk about, but I think that these are a couple of words of introduction, and we look forward to finding the sweet spot together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Des. I think something that's so powerful is also seeing the excitement in these opportunities and also rephrasing these challenges as possible new avenues for cooperation. I think these very powerful themes of climate will be touched on again during Ameer's presentation. We'll be looking at navigating the nexus of EU-AU cooperation in addressing climate challenges and also promoting peace and security.
Hi everyone, can everyone hear me well? Great. So today I want to talk a bit about the mix and the impact of climate on security in Africa. First, I want to thank the Spanish Embassy and ISS for hosting this event and for hosting us at ECFR as well. Okay, so first I'd like to make 3 key points, and then I'll assess them together and see what impact they could have on the EU-AU relationship in Africa. My first point is that while there is a strong link between climate change and security, it is important to complicate this traditional link and to view it with a bit more nuance. So traditionally, the basic argument has been that Climate change, such as droughts causing shocks to rain-fed agriculture, led to migration and reduced amount of resources, and then contestation over these reduced resources. This is manifested most obviously in the form of farmer-herder conflicts. And the most obvious case of this has been in Darfur, where the Darfur War is called the first climate change war. But as I said earlier, I'd like to complicate this a little bit. So what I'd like to say is that while climate change can result in reductions in resources, what matters in the end is how politics and political choices affect how these resources are allocated. This means that sometimes when you can have something quite counterintuitive, you can actually have an increase in aggregate resources. But if those increase flows to one group over another, this can actually lead to increased grievances and increased resentment. So, a key example of this is Mali, where we've seen farmer-herder conflict, but we've seen actually increased total agricultural resources, but it's about where these increased agricultural resources have flown. So in Central Sahel, a large amount of this has been broadly, and don't want to generalize too much, but that farmers have been the beneficiary of national governments, and this has led to grievances in herder populations and then resulted in conflict between herders and farmers. And so if we think that this link between climate change and security is more complicated, as I've just said, it should also impact policy. For example, in the old-fashioned paradigm, if you prevent desertification and manage to increase aggregate resources, the problem is solved. There's nothing to contest over. But changes in resources will almost necessarily affect resource allocation, and how the resources are allocated is a function of political and local and national political choices. So, for example, if you think this is a problem, you just pump more resources in, you might actually see a reversal in the trend. You might actually see an increase in insecurity. So we need to think about how we manage resources, and how and where and to whom and to where the resources flow. So, of course, this means this. I'm not trying to say this to say that we shouldn't pay any attention to increasing aggregate resources, but my point is that we should pay almost as much attention on how the resources flow and where they are allocated. A key example here is in Kenya, in Baringo and Laikipia provinces, where pastoralists claim that a lot of the waters are actually hosted on private or conservationist land, and this has led to increased contestation, even though there are sufficient resources overall. And as I'll touch on at the very end, for the European Union and African Union, this makes it a slightly complicated issue because this is a very local issue, and both of our organizations are more used to dealing with issues on a more national level. So this brings me to my second point, which is if we think of the link between climate and security as being real, then climate change action, most notably the form of climate change adaptation, can become a form of conflict prevention. And this actually happens in two ways. So when we do traditional climate change adaptation, we should recognize that these can have an effect on conflict efforts. So when we can actually view the two together as almost a form of dual use. And I recognize that's a bit confusing because adaptation and mitigation are also called dual use. But in this sense, I mean dual use between climate adaptation and conflict prevention at the same time. But it also means something else, which is that when we fund these climate projects, both whether it's the African Union or the European Union or all together, we should think about where these adaptation projects are located and how they affect or are affected by political choices. Do these projects, or do all of them occur in the same region? Do they inadvertently favor some groups over others? And how do we manage the change in resources that stem from these adaptation projects? And so this has ultimately a very important implication, which is that the way that countries adapt to climate change may in itself increase the risk of conflict. So a key example of this is again in Mali, in a town called Tolodje, where the creation of a new well ostensibly created to help increase access to herders for water resources actually ended up increasing tensions between farmers and herders. So in the old paradigm, you think that would just be the solution, but we can see in reality, the situation could be a bit more complicated. And so onto my third big observation, which is that climate risks and climate shocks also affect how conflict happens. So the most obvious example of this is in areas of pre-existing conflict, climate shocks can exacerbate pre-existing humanitarian crises. And currently the most obvious example of this is in Somalia, where obviously for about 2 or 3 decades there's been armed conflict, but recent floods have exacerbated the pre-existing humanitarian crisis and resulted, by the last time I checked, about 700,000 people being displaced. But the second is it also changes the nature of conflict itself. So one way I think this has happened is in the increase in fragmentation of conflict. We've seen a lot of areas where there's many more groups acting, sometimes within notionally the same banner, but also in divided areas, which makes negotiation and management, conflict management, incredibly difficult. So the most obvious example of this is Jenim in Mali. I'm using a lot of Mali examples today. But the example of Jenim in Mali, where the way they garner support in different areas depends on those areas. The pitch changes depending on trying to exploit these hyper-local grievances in what is a subnational organization, but also a hyper-local organization. And so returning to what this means for the European Union and African Union and policy, it means that when we attempt to do conflict prevention management, it means that we really have to go to the subnational level. So as we see with increased fragmentation and more generally, many groups no longer have national aspirations, but rely on very hyper-local grievances. And this means that approaches which are somewhat less fashionable, such as local dialogue, become more important. I'm going to advertise someone else from ECFR's work, Hannah Ray Armstrong, who wrote a piece on our website about this, but about how local dialogue, particularly in the Central Sahel, has been quite effective because a lot of the grievances that are held on the local level are actually quite tangible. They're about access to land, resources, to water, and are in the end can be quite solvable. A key example of this is President Bazoum before the coup. We had the outstretched hand policy and supported a peace process in North Tillaberi, which had some success and resulted in a decrease of violence of about 80% in 2022. This can't obviously be completely attributed to the local dialogue, but at least in part it had some effect. And we see again in another case from Mali, the Katiba Basila and Donso militias, which had some success in creating negotiations and agreements over resources. And so now to bring this back to policy, and to strike a perhaps more pessimistic note, but to highlight the challenges that exist, for the European Union and African Union, tackling these new trends in a changing global order will be difficult. Traditional approaches to conflict resolution, management, and prevention, most notably in the form of peace operations, either by the United Nations or by the African Union, have favored top-down approaches and also have favored militaristic approaches. So part of the reason is quite rational that functionally it's much easier to run these kind of missions, and they're much easier to fund and much easier to organize from on a continental basis. But the increased localism and impacts from climate shocks and fragmentation means that our two big organizations really have to get into the local. And with less cooperation internationally, doing this will become more difficult. Building the sufficient capacity and political will to sustain these local mediation efforts will likely be more difficult. So what is the way forward? So first is, as always, is recognizing the problem is more complicated than we would like it to be. So by realizing the relationship is more complicated than we often say, by placing more importance on climate adaptation as a form of conflict prevention, but also taking into note how climate has changed the nature of conflict, we can perhaps start building a new way forward for our two organizations. And within the context of the just transition, as the previous panelist so eloquently noted, it means that we can also find ways to do many things at the same time and do many necessary things we have to do at the same time. And to perhaps strike another note, I don't want to stand up here and pretend that these are all easy answers. Part of seeing the link between climate and conflict means recognizing unpredictability. The way that weather, precipitation, temperature, and agricultural systems change due to climate change, and how these changes interact with economic, social, and political choices and political processes mean that we can't always actually predict what is happening. So yeah, so that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, Ameer. And thank you to the panel. Thank you for putting this together and also pulling our attention towards these very pertinent issues. I would now like to invite all of us, our online audience included, to engage in a question and answer session. Please feel free to share your reflections and also pose some questions either directly to a certain panelist or to the panel in general. We'll take a few questions and then from there we'll ask each panel member to respond. At this time, would there be anyone that have some burning questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Steven Mkalapa. I'm the head of international relations for Belt One South Africa. I just want to make a reflection, and perhaps because we are all looking for that sweet spot. And I think the sweet spot should have started when we crafted the EU partnership. I think economically, we've tried to do well in finding the sweet spot. However, there are quite critical issues that we need to confront moving forward. And my question is to say, in our quest to find the common sweet spot, what is the EU's position in terms of the reform of the financial global mechanism? I think if we can find one another there and say, this will be a way where we can collectively try and influence the reform of the global financial security sector. The second one, which also linked to the reform, is the issue around the reform of the Security Council. I think the EU can take quite a lot of credibility when it can come up strong in terms of their position in the reform of the Security Council. I think we as Africans as well, we need to find consensus beyond the ESU. We need consensus in terms of how do we move forward with the reform of the Security Council. But part of the world problem at the moment centers around the fragmented and disorganized Security Council, and what is the EU's position on that? The last one is about restoration. How do we restore the confidence in the global world order? Because of the world has now gone from a rules-based order into a unipolar, or you can even say superpower mentality, which is taking us way back where we're coming from, and we're trying to run away from that. So I think it's just about how do we, between the AU and the EU, restore the confidence in terms of the international world-based rule order. And how do we work together in synergy for that, to find that sweet spot? Because of the crux of the matter and why we are here is to say, how do we move forward in terms of common synergy around finding that common vision for our continent. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Anyone else from the audience? Yes.
Thank you, Jana. Good morning still, everyone. My name is David Willimer. I work as a research officer on maritime security and development here at the ISS. So Europe and Africa are naturally connected by the ocean. The Mediterranean, Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean. In fact, South Africa's closest neighbor in the Indian Ocean is Eritrean state. However, we haven't seen ocean governance being a central feature in the cooperation between the partnership between Africa and Europe. I think it has only emerged since the fifth AU-EU summit in 2017. And I think we're at a point where the ocean is rising to the top of the global agenda. If you speak about the BBNJ, the WTO, fishery subsidies, still things like sea level rising and migration. I think of all the presentations today, a central link to that is the ocean, but this is not a common feature in discussions. So I'm just looking for, I guess, some thoughts on how we can elevate the role of the ocean within migration policies or climate change from an economic perspective and even maritime security at the top level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I can add a question from our online audience that is also in line with this, it's Timothy Walker asked to the panel, can the panel consider or elaborate on why the threat posed by climate change is still considered too controversial for the UN Security Council to address? I think this also ties into the themes of global governance and how we are currently structuring the world order. Panelists, if you would like to reflect on any of these questions, I think we'll start in the order for which you presented. So I look forward to also hearing your inputs on this. Dr. Monyani.
You would. Okay. She's done a delegation.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay, I'll take a couple of these. Although Stevens, I'd like to hear the European view of these reforms as well. Yeah. Let me address part of that question with the issue of one, the current movements, and two, the principles that should be guiding it. The one place that has had a bit of a movement has in fact been the issues around the global financial architecture. Yeah. And the Bridgetown agenda or the Bridgetown initiative, depending on your leaning on the day, has been one of the potential instruments to engage that reform. It's been a bit confused because the responses have been organizing for special drawing rights for individual players. And I think it's muddied the waters a little bit from the honest conversation we're supposed to be having. But it's not done yet. And that built up into the Paris Climate Finance Summit, where it was fairly prominent. There's going to be further discussion at COP. It's something that maybe we can move forward more radically. What this means around such movements, around de-dollarization, for example, about whether or not that's going to give us a fairer global financial architecture or put it in the other direction, we still have to work out what that actually means. Because as we have discovered in so many places, it isn't the first act that is the determination. It's what the response to that act is. Yeah. And we've got very big examples in the world where it's really important around how to engage that. I'm going to leave that one there. I just want to talk about the UN Security Council issue. If you're sitting in the global south, actually, I was reminded by someone during the week, we shouldn't be talking about the global south. We should be talking about the global majority. That is actually who we are. And you have the kind of representation that you do in the Security Council. It's really, really hard to be confident about what comes out of it. Not only because of the representation, but because of the way the voting actually happens and the interests. And with the current divide, it's on both sides of the divide. And this lack of democracy in the institution, both on composition and its own rules base, is very difficult to master. So if you borrow something from the climate world, and one of the big things that is supposed to be guiding our climate actions now, and most countries have endorsed this, at least informally, is the just transition framework. That there should be procedural justice, which means people must be allowed to participate in the decision making as a first point. Then you would restore confidence. That there is distributive justice, that people actually have a shot at being a beneficiary of those decisions as opposed to it being skewed in the classical unequal way that it continues to happen, is the second one. And the third one, which we must continue to insist on, is restorative justice. We are in an unequal world because of what happened before this. And there is a restorative justice that must play itself out. And not only in the climate arena, in a collective arena. So Steve, those would be my contributions to that, and also the question about the UNSC. But maybe I should hold back a bit. I'll address the ocean one if no one else does.
Wonderful.
Okay. On the ocean one, I'm not very grounded on maritime security, but of course I can say this. When it comes to ocean governance in the framework of EU-AU partnership, I wouldn't say that it's not like they don't recognize it as an important issue. It's just one of those emerging areas they're now trying to bring on board. And I was trying to make sure that I get the name right, because this year, just in April, the Africa-Europe Foundation organized a high-level discussion in April to have a discussion. There is also a report around that outlining on how EU and Africa can work on migration, ocean governance in relation to these other issues, including migration, which I think is very important because we have someone from IOM, a good friend of mine who works on missing persons who disappear in the sea, and that's a big thing. But I would make this general comment, which I needed to say as part of my presentation. Even as we speak about EU-AU partnership, especially as regards migration, I think chasing an equal partnership is an illusion, if you ask me. Let's just be grounded in the reality. Africa has its own unique issues. Like even when we talk about ocean governance, the way Africa experiences or the challenges or the opportunities that Africa wants to get as regards that are different from the EU's point of view. So if we are real, what do we need? What does Africa need? What does Europe need? Like when it comes to migration, of course, we know EU will need the young population from Africa to go work with them because there is that gap. But what does Africa want? So I don't want us to chase that. It's not a command, but I just think it's an illusion to chase equal partnership. And secondly, Africa needs a strategy, even as we engage in these discussions, which I think is lacking. Africa has aspirations, 2063 goals, aspirations. Where is the strategy to achieve those aspirations? So I think even when you go to the table to discuss maritime security, ocean governance, there should be a strategy. Otherwise, the current model we see on donor recipient will remain for a very long time. Thank you.
And yeah, so I guess I'm best placed to tackle the one on international financial architecture. And I guess my answer here might be somewhat disappointing, but on the international financial architecture, because of the structure of the World Bank and IMF, which are the core parts of it, it requires completely international cooperation. It also requires just not only Europe and Africa, but also most notably require collaboration from the United States and also from China and Japan, who's also a major shareholder. So I think that's partly why we see, like in Europe, France has really taken the lead on this with the Summit for a New Global Financial Pact. And it's starting to make some headway, but I think one of the big answers is what kind of political will is there for the changes that are needed? How high can we aim? And part of this is, the World Bank and IMF already doing some things, such as the capital adequacy frameworks. But no, obviously these won't cut the mustard. There needs to be more on top of that. But this is unfortunately quite a difficult international one. So it's not just for our two continents to discuss.
Wonderful. Thank you, panelists. I'd like to open up to the floor again if there's any other personal questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much. Manokwashi from IOM. I would like to reflect on some of the issues on migration, also how the refocusing of maybe AU-EU partnership, as far as even the AFCT is concerned here. We have the Continental Free Trade Agreement on migration, which is more or less trade, but there's no trade without people moving around. Now, if you look at the basic statistics, almost close to or plus minus 70% of people move within the continent. Now, if we are tackling the issues of irregular flows and also talking about disappearances and deaths, especially the Indian Ocean where people are crossing to the Mayotte side to reach Europe, but these statistics are quite minute also. If we want to look at more or less like refocusing the agenda on more or less like partnership within the AU and EU framework, comprising the discussions that were held in Cairo and also some of the key discussions that are more or less like to reprioritize the migration agenda, which will also skew towards more of like development agenda. How do we even look at remittances and also labor migration within the continent? There has been programs on the joint labor migration programs and also looking at how we can also support the continent. But at the rec level, you realize that ECOWAS has its own migration dynamics. You have EAC, you have SADC, and you also have the IGAD. It is difficult to really cluster all this within a bigger umbrella to say you're tackling migration issue without actually addressing what is the migration issue for SADC. Even within SADC, you have South Africa as a main recipient. You also have Zimbabwe as a main sender. But if you look at the ECOWAS model, and also reflected by Margaret quite well, we have the EAC and we also have the ECOWAS model. Such countries have developments that are par, and you are talking about migration at the continental level, it will be difficult to really tackle it. Then we look at this from a broader perspective where AU and also EU, tackling it from more a security point of view, it becomes difficult to actually address some of the issues because Africa is speaking the language of migration development. EU speaking migration and security, how do we ensure that we also achieve a common ground? But it's more of a question, how do we address this issue coming forward? And also look at AU 2063 agenda. We also have the AFCT and also the global goals here. We have the GCM as well. So more of a reflection than like a question or a comment. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to just build on that question as well with a question from our online audience as to how can the EU and the AU collaborate to build consensus on migration governance that respects the rights and dignities of migrants? I think this is also just going forward, if you could take a forward-looking slant. Any other questions from the floor? Yes.
Yes, I have a question, but before that an answer, because the question that Stephen's posed has not been answered. Regarding the position of the European Union on Security Council reform, the answer is we do not have a common position. Some countries in the European Union are permanent members of the Security Council. France is, so was the UK until Brexit. They're still in the Council, they're not in Europe, I mean. Germany is part of a group that seeks a permanent seat for a few countries specifically, together with Japan, India, and what's the fourth? And Brazil. That's right. And other countries, including Spain, form an alliance, Spain and Mexico and Italy and other countries from America and Asia and so on, and an alliance called United for Consensus. That actually, I think, shows what I meant before by tweaks. Maybe we should call them prudent reform instead of major overhaul, to use your words, Professor Naidoo. United for Consensus aims at limiting the use of veto, extending the period of some countries, including African countries, adding more African countries to better represent the population, extending the period that they're in the council and making it possible for them to repeat the period they are there. That would also solve one problem in the Zulwini consensus, which is that the consensus does not say which two African countries would be the one with a permanent seat and a veto. And I'm sure from South Africa, everybody agrees that South Africa would be one of them. I don't know if the rest of the continent agrees with you on that. And the second seat will also be very disputed. Plus, and this is the question, in a way, if you actually, the question would be when you talk about a major overhaul of, that also goes to Professor Monyani's comment about the partnership of equals and the strategy. I agree, it's not a partnership of equals, nor should it be. I mean, like a marriage is not, I mean, you're not equal. The husband and the wife are not, we're not equal in a proper sense of the word. We're not the same, but it's a partnership that works. And the same should be built with Africa. Point number one, and point number two, what you said about the strategy. The same goes for the major overhaul. So my question is, to put it back to you, Professor Naidoo, and the panel in general. So those that actually want a major overhaul have failed, in my opinion, please correct me if you think I'm wrong, to point out how that major overhaul would be, what rules would actually be changed. And if you extrapolate from the Zulwini consensus and you say, okay, this is the major overhaul we want 2 permanent seats with veto for Africa. Well, Asia is going to, these G4 countries, Brazil, India, Germany, and Japan will ask for the 4 seats. And at least we'll have a Security Council with at least 11 members with a permanent seat and a veto. Does anybody think that would work better? It obviously would not, I think. 11 vetoes means the Security Council will become absolutely dysfunctional. So the question is, those that want to propose a major overhaul, what is the strategy for Africa and beyond?
Wonderful. Is there any other questions from the floor? Yes.
Just to respond to the Ambassador's comments on the Security Council. Ambassador, the ISS has undertaken a campaign for the last couple of years called Elect the Council. And it's a very radical proposal for reformation or completely reforming the UN Security Council. The proposal, everyone here can visit it. You can go to www.electthecouncil.org. It's a proposal that the ISS primarily led by our African Futures program that the ISS has put together. But it's basically looking at acknowledging that the current debates within the General Assembly, the negotiations, intergovernmental negotiations, will ultimately lead nowhere. It's acknowledging that and saying if we had to completely ignore that process, could we potentially look at a reformed council that is purely based, that is on a democratization of the council? So no permanency. And so it's a very radical proposal. It's just for your interest. I'd encourage you all to visit the website to read up on that proposal.
Sounds good to me. Now you need to get the P5 to agree to it.
Wonderful. And thank you, Priya. And thank you for everyone also engaging. Just one quick comment. I do encourage this, sharing your opinions as well, because we know we are in a room full of experts. So please, if you do have these opinions, please raise your hand. Yes, sir.
Yes. I think my follow-up is around the issue of the regional economies. What is the EU's position in terms of the role of regional economies? The EU-Africa-AU partnership was crafted on the basis of ensuring that you collectively deal with regional economies, vis-a-vis doing bilateral economic commissions. Now we have seen the growth of regional economies. We just concluded AGOA, and 2 weeks ago we had the BRICS. Where is the EU around the issues around regional economies? Because it looks like the shift of the world is going towards more of working with regional economies rather than bilateral. So where are you in terms of that? Are you still focused on dealing collectively, or do you want to go bilateral?
Thank you very much. I think that's a very interesting question. Before I hand over to the panel, also in our next panel, we'll be taking on some of these challenges as well. So the questions that stand over, we can also pose then. Just generally, if you can give some reflections on your respective area of expertise, what do you see the way forward being? What are some practical on-the-ground manifestations or policy steps that can be taken to achieve all of these goals and these small twinks, as we said? So I'd like to start with Ameer this time, if he can share his perspectives.
So I think it really comes back down to one of the most fundamental parts of the relationship, as you mentioned, that to move to something resembling a more equal partnership, maybe not an equal one, but a more equal one. And it means cooperating in areas where interests are shared and not necessarily where Europe feels like it should be doing something, but where it doesn't really want to. So I think when we talk about security, that's a big area, but also climate is the other area, and also in energy, which is not really the topic of the panel right now, but might be discussed later on. And I think these are real areas of cooperation and something that should be taken on. More so on the area that I was talking about, link between climate and security, there's a real link between the global climate goals, international financing, and the Europe-Africa relationship there. It's a real area where there's interest of both sides, and they can really make some progress on this. We see with the 100 billion goal that we mentioned earlier, 100 billion is likely to be all just for needs just for climate adaptation in Africa, not for all developing countries all around the world. So we see that it's perhaps the start of developing more robust tools, new tools that can help meet the challenges. And it also means in the cooperation between the two organizations, in security, we can see that there's been discussions about CES contributions for the African Union, and to which Europe is obviously a big funder as well to the United Nations itself. And this is another area where there could be real movement towards new partnership between Europe and Africa that could perhaps lead to real results.
Okay, just a few reflections, and clearly we need to find a dinner sponsor because there's a lot to talk about. Firstly, so the things that you spoke about, in my definition, will not constitute small tweaks. They actually start moving in the direction of major overhaul. Maybe this is just a language issue, because I know Spanish is much more precise than English. But I think that the fundamentals around this, and maybe the dilemma of the biggest multilateral system that there is currently, which is the UN, is that part of the reason why certain countries continue to contribute in the way that they do to the operation is directly related to the power that they wield in this. So you can't just have this democratization of representation without a democratization of funding and financing. And that's not an easy problem to solve. And this is something I think we've got to be a lot more innovative about. Will there be regional competitions around representation? Of course there will. But there are ways to resolve those kinds of things as well. So I think that's for a much longer discussion. And I think a fair amount of it's going to happen in the next panel as well. The other thing I want to directly respond to is, is this a whole issue around, let me preamble this thing. When we have technical discussions with other technical folk, largely non-political folk, but certainly folk that have the label of being official spokespeople on both sides of this, and I'll talk to climate change, which is what I'm more familiar with. Reaching common ground is really rapid. And then we collectively grumble and express the anxiety that the people who are eventually going to sign off on these decisions are actually going to mess up the thing that we're agreeing to. And I think we must find better ways of organizing for that to happen in a more graduated fashion. And there must be ways to do it, because if there isn't, we're going to be in trouble for the longest time. The third thing I just want to put on the plate is, Stephen's raised this, but let me broaden it. It's when people are not finding what they need in a particular playing field, they create new ones, and they create it rapidly. And we have seen the rise of plurilateralism in every sphere. And many of them will solve immediate problems. Many of them will also contribute to the challenge of actually having a global multilateral architecture that works in the longer term. And our ability to navigate that really becomes paramount. I mean, one of the difficulties of the world as it is right now is that very few people are actually thinking long term. There's an immediate crisis that has to be solved. We put a couple of people together, we'll work that one out, and then we'll deal with the next one as it comes along. And then the last point to put in the plate is that the manifestation of some of these issues is really immense. I mean, just with a colleague from the IOM and what he raised around the migration issue, the impact of migration on the rise of the right wing, not only in Europe. Europe is a bit shocking now with the Netherlands, but around the world is a serious, serious concern. I can tell you that is already a feature in the run-up to the South African election, not just about elsewhere. So the multiple implications of us not finding those solutions quickly enough are really radical.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So there is a question on ensuring protection of migrants in the partnership. It all starts, why are people moving? Because if people are moving because of conflict, you know, the root causes, that's where it starts. We need to focus on addressing root causes. And at the border, when people are crossing, it's not just about control, it's about educating the border officials. Can they differentiate between a trafficker, a smuggler, a trafficked individual, a smuggled individual, if I might call them like that, and a traveler? Sometimes those nitty-gritties is always in the details. And then when they move the other side, because when we speak about closed borders, people always assume closed or open borders has to do with the ease in accessing visas. It also has to do with, once you cross the border, how much freedom are you allowed to participate in the society that you join or in the host country. So even if it's easy for me to get a visa to come to South Africa, but when I get here, I can't get a job. I can't access healthcare. That's still a closed border. So there's various things we can do to ensure protection of migrants. But I think, as I will always insist, because I'm an African and Africa is our business, Africa needs to step up. I know the EU has been a great partner and it continues to be one, but you see where cases that if we might use them, the Middle East issue, if you saw it in the news, from the Horn of Africa, many migrants were going to Middle East, and the governments, I don't know if they were caught unaware or they were aware, they just didn't want to do anything. Now you see, those states are now trying to rush to get bilateral agreements. Why? Because the migrants were on social media, showing how they are undergoing mistreatment in the other side. I don't know if they didn't advertise that on the social media, what could have happened. Now you see, the government is like following up. The legal pathways are coming after suffering. Why can't we just have them in place already so that to allow to allow free movement of individuals on the continent and beyond? Thank you.
Thank you so much, panelists. I think this conversation is very insightful, and a lot of the key themes we couldn't fully get into. I know the next panel, there will be ample time to do this. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you now if you would like to take a quick 5-minute break. At 5 past, we will be reconvening and starting again. If you want to grab a quick coffee and then come to enjoy it inside. Thank you very much to our panelists. It was sincerely appreciated, and I think they deserve a round of applause. And then to our online audience, please bear with us. It'll be 5 minutes for us to quickly stretch our legs, and then we'll be back with the next panel. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much. I learned a lot.
I have realized there was an oversight. No, I'm going to you.
Okay.
There was a big oversight on our.
Just to bring to your delve into the second panel of our seminar. It's important. We will be looking at understanding the EU-AU partnership in a changing global landscape. We are fortunate to have two distinguished speakers with us here today who will illuminate crucial facets of this development. Firstly, we have Mr. Theodore Murphy, the Director of the Africa Programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And secondly, we have Peter Fabricius, an independent foreign policy journalist and analyst. I'd like to remind you once again that their full bios can be seen at the back of your programs. Understanding the EU-AU partnership in a changing global landscape requires nuanced exploration of the intricate dynamics that shape this collaboration amidst the evolving currents of our world. As a global landscape undergoes profound transformation, the EU and the AU find themselves at a pivotal intersection. This panel will delve deeper into the strategic considerations and adaptive measures both unions must undertake to foster a resilient partnership in the face of emerging global shifts. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Theodore Murphy to the stand. He will be looking at adapting alliances, the EU-AU partnership amidst global shifts and a rise of middle powers.
Thank you, everybody. It's fantastic to be here. My thanks first and foremost to our wonderful hosts at ISS, but also the Spanish Embassy, who was kind enough to look and find us in Europe and encourage us very strongly and persuasively to come and join you here. I'm going to talk with you today about changing global order, and that's something that we at the European Council are preoccupied with very much. I want to start with two observations about how Europe could be doing this better and about how Africa could be doing it better, by which I mean figuring out how global order is evolving and how they can adapt to it. The problem that we face in Europe, I think, is that we are a little bit too sentimental about global order, particularly the rules-based order, which is a specific kind of global order. And that sentimentality prevents us from having a very clear analysis about how much has changed and where things are going from here. And that's going to be critical for us as Europe to understand if we want to continue to secure our peace and prosperity. On Africa's side, and I say this with some modesty because I think many of you here will know better, I see that the historical scars of the Cold War period are serving as the template for how Africa forecasts what is coming in a changing global order, and most importantly, what Africa needs to prevent against. And I think the changing shape of global order offers many different permutations than that which Africa is preparing for. We might say Africa is preparing for Cold War redux, except this time between the US and China, and doing everything it can not to be separated and forced into two blocks. But I think actually something else is coming. And more than that, I don't think it's just coming. I think we're in the midst of it. We've already moved on from this time when the rules-based order was at its apex. I'm going to have to say a little bit about how the US and China are approaching global order before I come back to Europe and Africa. But even before that, let me just try to outline for you some of the major changes. And I think that'll help explain why we're in a kind of inevitable trajectory of change. One thing that's so important right now is the rise of middle powers the world over. And I would count South Africa very much as a middle power there as well. But we're looking also at Turkey, at India, at Gulf players, at Indonesia. Now, these world powers, I think, middle powers, have a fantastic attunement to the changes that are going on, because unlike us in Europe, who see these changes as threatening us, they are seeing this as a moment of opportunity. So what the middle powers, I think, are seeing is that as the guardrails or as the rules of this rules-based order loosen, and as we shift from something that might have been seen as a more unipolar global order, this is something from the 1990s where the US was the predominant power. And as we get a major challenge to the US from China, that space is opening up for them to spread their wings and for them to see how far they can get. Now, when the middle powers are thinking in this way, they're not obsessed with taking their increasing influence and using it to strengthen the rules-based order. That's not what I hear talking with anybody from these countries. What they're interested in is to see how far those stretched wings can carry them in terms of their own sovereignty, in terms of their own influence and power. And that's a second very important characteristic of this changing global order. If we look back at the Cold War, a lot of states were just newly coming into independence. And they might have had a bit of shaky self-confidence about where they were on the world stage. In the interactions that we have with ECFR and these powers, there's no sign of insecurity. It's quite the opposite. We may call them middle powers. I don't think they see themselves as middle powers. Some of them see themselves as great powers in waiting, in the making. If you talk to countries like Turkey, they have a rich history going back far further than Europe's high point, where they saw themselves as preeminent global players. Why not again? Why not again? So the way those middle powers are pursuing that influence, I think, is very important. And there's some lessons there for Europe and for Africa. Now, if we come to the Chinese and the US, again, this is important for us to understand where we are because they are still defining the overall framework. I think that China is betting on the US failing to manage to corral and group the rest of the world into an alliance bloc that would be directed at China. The problem that we have as Europe is that the language being used and the concepts being used in this US effort overlap and elide with those of defense of the rules-based order. They sound like the same thing. When the US talks about framing things in binary context and framing things in terms of support of the rules-based order, that appeals very much to us in Europe. So that's exactly what we're here for. But if you look at how the US is actually behaving and you forecast going forward, US is very much in competition with China. And it takes some of those legs and instruments of the rules-based order and is already, we could say, abandoning their original purpose, which was to be a framework for everyone in the globe to abide by, and starting to repurpose them towards competition with China. To be concrete about this, I think a great example is in the free trade space. Okay. Free trade is definitely a pillar of the rules-based order. And it's supposed to be part of the framework that guides all of our interactions in a rules-based way. The US is definitely looking at trade now as an element of industrial policy. And that industrial policy is aimed towards making the US competitive with China. It may serve a second, more distant objective as well, which is to make the US independent from any kind of dependence on China. So there we look at a US who might pursue decoupling, okay, from China. An incredibly ambitious task, given how far we've come in globalization since 1989 and Fukuyama's The End of History and since this universal era. When I say China is betting on this failing, think back to what I was saying about the middle powers and ask yourself if a power with the characteristics that I described, ambition, sense of historical destiny, sense of being disadvantaged for a long time as well, are they ready to be subsumed into a bloc? I don't think so. I don't think it's going to work. So I think China's offer is much more, let's say, realistically tilted towards a fragmenting global order. China's not trying to set up, at least not yet, a new alternative rules-based order. It's trying to make offers all over the place. It's dealing in interests and offers and trying to bring as many countries as possible into this kind of relationship with China. I think most particularly you here in Africa will know better than me, but China isn't talking a lot about values. It's talking a lot about Africa's economic development and what China can bring to that table. Okay, So where does that bring us, or where does that take us as Europe? Just one word on why we're so in love with the rules-based order. We had a terrible time in the early part of the 20th century. The two world wars, devastating for everybody, but particularly for us. And what we learned as Europe, I think collectively coming out of the two world wars, was that this rules-based order is the way to preserve and salvage our peace and prosperity going forward. So what's so important about the rules-based order for us is that it's a framework. It's not about us as individual countries or even as the European Union pursuing individual relationships with countries around the world based on our strategic interests. Our strategic interests are the rules, okay? But we also need to wake up. This is the part where the sentimentality needs to be put to sleep. We saw in the COVID period how aggressively different states were pursuing their own national interest. We saw that we did the same when it came down to it. Then more recently, we saw with Russia's aggression in Ukraine that we could say another nail in the rules-based coffin or another attack on it. And this is something that's been coming home to us slowly. But it's difficult for us to change because this rules-based order has been incredibly good to us. And because all we had to do in that period was sort of be the best student in the class of interweaving interdependence. All that we had to do was follow the rules in good standing, be the right pupils, make our contributions, okay? Not prioritize military force. And things would just inevitably, the world over, radiate out. You could say in one way it was about trying to bring and expand what we thought was a very attractive Europe, within the European Union, to the rest of the world. And we thought, more or less, in this unipolar area, that this was an inexorable march forward. It's quite a wake-up call for us to see that that's not the case. And not only that, it demands very radical changes that is difficult for us to do. Because when we are together as a European Union, with all of our states, I think we approach a kind of great power standing in terms of our economies. In terms of our militaries, not so much, but maybe we're getting there, right? But we can't act in that unified fashion. Our union is not so absolute that we can move in the way that China can with a state-backed economy and the US as well. I said I wanted to talk also a little bit about what this meant for Africa. As I've been discussing this with Africans in different formats, what Africa was hearing as these tensions grew up around COVID, around Ukraine particularly, around the demands for Africa to take sides, was that the issue at hand was not actually Ukraine, but that Ukraine was symbolic for taking sides in two camps. And all of us here and my colleagues in the European diplomatic cadre, I think have probably spoken to you a number of times about this, and we've all learned very well that that is not something that Africa is willing to do. Right? Africa wants to prevent being put into those two camps. But I would argue that if you're with me so far on the way the US is potentially approaching things and the way China is potentially approaching things, the middle factors are the X factor. And where for us in Europe, or for those who are building one camp, if you are able to get a critical mass of middle powers and others on your side, you could either reinvigorate the rules-based order or invest it in a new one. But I don't think we're there right now. I think we're in this time of sort of polyamory and playing the field. Now, that makes me worried, though, for Africa. Because what I've been seeing in Africa is that this time of competition, as much as Africans are worried about what it might demand of them in terms of splitting into two camps, it's also a time of opportunity, let's be honest. There's greater interest than you have ever had before from the US, from Europe, but now importantly also for middle powers. Now Europe is still playing the game in Africa, pursuing the relationship in Africa in the rules-based way. So the assets it brings, the things it brings to the relationship, you know them very well, you know how they work. The assertive middle powers are not doing that. And they bring different things than we do in Europe. Some of them might be also very interesting and complementary, but they definitely don't follow a rules-based game. Now, this can be more for Africa under certain conditions. So if Africa and African states are powerful and competent enough to be in the driver's seat with these relationships, then they should encourage all comers. Fantastic. More economic development, right? Important, key for the 2063 agenda, top priority. More friends for rainy days. And Africa has seen that there's a lot of rainy days in this new era as well. COVID was COVID, but the debt crisis, interest rates, crush on commodities, Africa feels all of that more. And if the rules-based order can't provide perfectly for Africa's needs in times of crisis, you also need to diversify relationships. But we've seen other cases when African states, the African continental framework is not very strong, and middle powers get engaged in an incredibly robust way. It's very destructive. So if we look at the group of states, we have to find a name for it. You can call it the coup belt or something else. I know it's not perfect, but stretching from the east of Africa now through the Sahel, I would not say all those countries are driving their relations with the external powers. I think particularly in Sudan right now. So this is a part where Africa could harness the opportunity if it's in charge, but it becomes a playing field for other powers and their interests when it's not in charge. And that's unfortunately what we're seeing in Sudan. And it's not cost-free, as an enormous cost, actually, for Africa. So just to wrap up there, what does this mean for Europe, Africa? Look, I think that, and we've talked about the CDCFR, that we in Europe need to come up with a new idea for this new phase in global order. We've given it the title of strategic interdependence. It will mean more to people in Europe than here why we call it that and not something else. There's another term called strategic autonomy, which many people in Europe associate with abandoning the US. But this idea of strategic interdependence basically starts with Europe identifying its interests, very much taking a bit of a lesson from the middle powers, and then figuring out in different parts of the world, especially I think here with Africa, how to pursue those interests, where those interests overlap, and what we can do to invest and strengthen them. Now that may sound simple, but it's quite different than what you may have seen Europe doing in the beginning, which is basically investing in this framework of the rules-based order that we think should radiate out all over the world and being guided by that. It's an interest-based approach. There can be tons of win-win in it, and it will demand of us to understand and listen to our friends in Africa with a much keener ear, because we will need them just as much as they'll need us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Theodore. I think this was a great launching point also to go into our next conversation that will very much be looking at the global developments such as the AU joining the G20 and what that would ultimately mean within this bigger space of shifting tectonic plates. I'd like to call Peter Fabricius to the foreground to expand a bit on the AU's role in the G20 and the strategic implications of this for the EU-AU partnership.
Thanks very much, Jana, and thanks to the ISS and to the Spanish ambassador for the great honor of being invited to address the seminar. The G20 club of the world's most important economies is about to become, in effect, the G21. Though it's not yet quite clear if that will be its new name. The African Union, which has been attending G20 summits for many years as a guest, was admitted as a full permanent member of the G20 at the New Delhi summit in September this year. And it officially, I'm told, joins the forum on Friday this week, actually, when the presidency of this forum of systemically significant countries passes from India to Brazil. It's already attended a virtual summit hosted by India on November 22nd. Joining the G20, I think, is likely to be sometimes difficult voyage of discovery for the AU with many opportunities and many challenges. Admitting the AU was a logical step for the G20 since the continent has had a muted voice in global discussion and decision-making on vital issues, even as some of the world's greatest challenges, including ones upmost on the G20's agenda, like global warming, are most keenly felt by some of the world's poorest nations, many of them which are in Africa. Perhaps also the interests of the continent cannot in the end be adequately represented by its current sole African member, South Africa, even though it tried, since its comparative wealth and sophistication often give it a slightly different perspective, though, of course, there's also many commonalities. Not everyone was wildly enthusiastic about the AU joining the G21 here. Some Asian members felt ASEAN should have been admitted, and some Western nations were apprehensive lest the AU enter on the other side of the camp, as it were. But India's Modi pushed for AU admission in large part because he is projecting India rather than China as the real champion of the global South. And of course, as we've heard today, the AU was arguably accepted in the G20 finally, perhaps because of the rising tensions and polarization of global powers, which peaked with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Since then, both Russia and Ukraine and their allies have intensified their efforts to win a divided Africa to their side. So clearly no one wanted to be seen to block Africa's accession to the G20. Yet it is those same rising global tensions which will confront the AU on the G20/G21 as it battles to achieve continental consensus on divisive issues. The AU is clearly less equipped to do that than the European Union, which is a supranational body whose members have conceded considerable foreign policy sovereignty to Brussels. This means the EU can formulate foreign policy to a greater degree and articulate it at the G20. By contrast, the AU is only an intergovernmental body in which member states have retained almost all autonomy, I would say, of foreign policy. This means it could have difficulty achieving consensus. And purely from the point of view of mechanics, it is not completely clear if the AU is quite ready for this imminent G20 membership. The question of who will represent the AU in the G20 is still a little fuzzy. The more institutionalized EU, as we know, is represented both by its Commission and Council chairs, presidents. The AU resolved at its February summit this year that it would be represented by the AU chairperson, supported by the AU Commission. However, a few commentators have suggested that having the AU chair as the principal representation of the AU, the G20, is somewhat unsatisfactory because it's a position rotating yearly. It seems that what we're looking at is that both the AU chair and the Commission will attend. Although I'm told that the idea that was first proposed by Ibrahim Mayaki, the former NEPAD chief executive, of perhaps a former head of state to drive the process, is still floating. AU Commission Chairperson Musa Faki Mohammed has appointed the AU Commissioner for Trade and Industry, Albert Machanga, to drive the process of preparing for entry. It seems likely that he himself will represent the AU in the G20 finance track, attending meetings of finance ministers, although I don't think that's been officially announced. Other details about who will be the Sherpa, who will attend the vast array of other meetings in the G20 calendar remain a little bit fuzzy, at least to me. As Paul Simon Handy and Felicite Gillot pointed out in ISS Today earlier this year, the AU will have a great deal of preparatory work to do beyond the usual preparations of any national member. It will face the additional task of forging a common consensus amongst 52 member states on a range of issues. And as they pointed out, on some geopolitical issues, which they probably hadn't really thought about much. One, of course, of those issues that we've heard much about today, obviously, and we continually hear about, is the Russia's war against Ukraine, the issue that has already proved most divisive globally, including at the UN, where African states have split roughly in half, and where where the G20 itself has been sharply divided. I take Dhesigen's point very forcefully that, of course, what we are now seeing is a whole new front in the struggle, which is, I think, to a large degree, one could argue, and maybe this is a topic for another day, neutralized quite a lot of the arguments that have emanated from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I mean, principally, of course, raising a lot of questions about the West's position on the conflict, sense of indulgence, I guess, of Israel's bombardment of Gaza, which doesn't chime too well with its sharp criticism of Russia and its bombardment of Ukraine. As I said, it's a topic for another day. But these issues illustrate the predicament that the EU will confront joining a polarized and likely rapidly further polarizing G20. The G20's high watermark, as we know, was in 2008 when it played a decisive role in resolving the global financial crisis. Since then, it has been unable to resolve comparable challenges like climate change, regulation of AI, etc. One could argue it has reached the point now of focusing to some degree on its own survival. Many countries of the global south in particular praised Indonesia's President Joko Widodo and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi for both managing to produce leaders' declarations at their G20 summits in 2022 and 2023, respectively, despite the sharp divisions over the war in Ukraine. Foreign policy analyst James Crabtree, a former advisor to British Prime Ministers Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, said at a seminar this month of the European Parliamentary Research Service that both did so by setting the bar rather low. Widodo got away with it by including a reference in the declaration to how some members, but not all, had voted for the UN General Assembly a resolution of March 2, which condemned Russia's aggression. And Modi went a step further by negotiating Russia's war right out of the text of the leaders' declaration in September. The Indian press has credited South Africa and Brazil, the next two G20 presidents, significantly, with helping Indonesia do that. But Crabtree attributed it largely to Western G20 members being willing to give Modi a free pass because India is so important to them strategically. Consider the Quad, for example. He suggests that Brazil would not have the same clout next year, and I think it goes without saying, nor would South Africa the following year. As we've heard today, South Africa and many other countries of the global south, which adopt a non-aligned position, insist that geopolitical issues like Russia's war on Ukraine are not the proper province of G20, which should focus only on financial and economic issues such as in 2008. But the G20's mandate has steadily, it seems, spread beyond the purely financial. And of course, the financial and economic and political are becoming increasingly inseparable, as Russia's war in itself has illustrated, since it had such a major impact on the global economy, including inflating global grain prices and creating food security, which has disproportionately impacted Africa. How will the AU navigate these waters and what choppy waters, and what chances there of the AU and the EU cooperating and collaborating on the G20, which is the principal topic of our discussion today? The two bodies, of course, have something important in common as the two multinational entities among 19 nation member states on the G20, and the EU has gathered considerable G20 experience, which it could share with the AU. There's also plenty the AU and the EU could cooperate on the G20, including some major pillars of the wider cooperation, such as migration, trade, climate change, as well as other issues on the G20 agenda, such as debt relief, global taxation, digital tax, and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, by 2030. Elizabeth Sideropoulos, who's Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs, who was on the International Advisory Board of India's T20 and co-chair of the Task Force on Accelerating the SDGs, believes that the AU will need to be very clear about its priorities and focus its energies on them, working to influence the EU and others to get very specific proposals on the agenda. One priority should be debt relief and how to improve the G20 common framework for debt treatment. The collapse of the Zambian debt deal over the last few days, which was regarded as a test case for the framework, has underlined flaws in the approach which need to be addressed. The EU has offered to share its experience and support to the AU and to embark on joint projects, but the AU has not been very responsive, one hears, at least so far, except for accepting some support from the German Development Agency. In any case, Sideropoulos and others don't think that the AU needs right now consultants from the Europe or anywhere else, but a sharper focus on its own interests. The Samoa Agreement, which replaces the Cotonou Agreement as the framework for relations over the next 20 years between the EU and the ACP countries, has just been signed. This is seen as an encouraging success of multilateral cooperation and otherwise fraught multilateral environment. Yet there are some hints of tension between the AU and the EU. Scheduled November 20th meeting between their foreign ministers to assess inter-summit progress was mysteriously cancelled or postponed. I understand also a meeting of the AU Peace and Security Council with its EU counterpart also similarly cancelled or postponed. I think I enjoyed your remarks, Ambassador, about the fact that the EU tends to be accused of either being overbearing or underachieving or under-delivering, and I think that encapsulates in a way the relationship that the EU has had with Africa. I think it gives us the sense that to some degree the EU is a kind of lightning rod, I suppose, for reaction to Africa's relationship with the developed world, because it's precisely because it is most engaged, and I think when you act, you also err. So some of these remarks that I make now should be regarded within that framework of the relationship, and the fact that an acknowledgement of the reality that when you act, you err. So Sideropoulos, for example, believes that a reset in relations is necessary to establish the trust that will be necessary to collaborate on the G20. She believes some of the trust has been lost in the way Europe has handled the fraught issue of migration from Africa, as we touched on earlier, and also because of the vaccine nationalism, as it's been branded and exhibited during the COVID crisis. Though the EU and member states, one also has to remember, are partnering with Africa in developing vaccines too. A major pillar of the Africa-Europe relationship is trade, with the exception of SADC and some other patches on the continent. The original goal of having economic partnerships covering all of sub-Saharan Africa has not really succeeded, and even as that position remains somewhat frozen, the EU's common border adjustment mechanism looms on the horizon. To quote Sideropoulos, there's a phase-in period, but if you think that the African industries can repurpose themselves in 3 years or even 5 years, you're living in a dream world. On climate change, there's considerable potential for cooperation between the AU and EU, including sharing green energy technology, and for instance, in Europe, ensuring that the beneficiation of critical African minerals like lithium takes place on the continent, so we don't end up buying lithium batteries from foreign countries, as South African International Relations and Cooperation Minister Naledi Pandor said last weekend. That also goes, the cooperation, of course, also goes more widely to scaling up the just energy transition partnerships, like the one with South Africa, to the wider continent, as Dhesigen touched on earlier. The rules of the game will have to change, many believe. European governments will have to step up and play a greater role in leveraging their private sectors to finance these just energy transitions to renewable energy. And she sees a double standard, Sideropoulos does, in the advanced economies, discouraging Africa from exploiting its gas, even as they have stepped up their own use of gas and other fossil fuels as a result of the Ukraine crisis. In their defense, and I'm sure they will rise to their own defense on this, one could probably regard these as temporary emergency measures in a war situation. Likewise, European and US governments should change the rules of the multilateral development banks to scale up their lending, and on global and digital tax, both of which are on the G20's agenda. These are matters which also need to be addressed and perhaps rethought. A global minimum tax is a fine idea in broad terms, says Sideropoulos, but then exempting a bunch of your industries that are important to your advanced economies is maybe not. How the AU will conceive its role in the G20 is not quite clear. Some regard the G7 as the caucus of the global north in the G20, and the BRICS is the countervailing caucus of the global south. If that is so, then the BRICS caucus has just been strengthened by two G20 members, Saudi Arabia joining BRICS at the August summit this year, though subsequently we've seen that the newly elected right-wing populist Argentine President Javier Milei might very well not accept the offer of BRICS membership after all. In any case, would the AU tend to strengthen the BRICS caucus if there is such a thing? Probably. Or will it see the BRICS itself cannot realistically be regarded as the champion of the global south and the herald of a new order when it includes two powerful members, China and Russia, each pursuing their own global agendas. This becomes apparent when one realizes that for all the BRICS rhetoric about democratizing global governance, Russia and China have still not explicitly and unambiguously supported the ambitions of the other three original BRICS members, South Africa, India, and Brazil, to be given permanent seats on the UN Security Council. I think that's kind of what you were reflecting. It's time up.
Yes.
Okay. Clearly, the AU needs to keep its eye closely on the ball to identify the continent's concrete interests and pursue them in collaboration with the EU and other partners.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think that this goes to show how much there is to be said on this topic. And then without further ado, I can imagine our audience is also itching to have their own commentary on these wonderful presentations we just had. I'd like to open the floor. Is there anyone that would like with initial commentary? Well, wonderful. Yes.
Maybe not commentary, but maybe some questions, if I may. Those who don't know, my name is Sven Botha. I'm a lecturer in the Political Sciences Department at the University of Pretoria. Thank you both for very insightful presentations. Perhaps first, if we look at the AU's ascension to the G20, two questions there. Number one, there was strong European support for that particular move. What does that mean for the relationship between Africa and the European Union? Is there perhaps room for the sweet spot now, as you put it? Do we perhaps lean a little bit more towards that? Is it perhaps more achievable, given European support for the AU's ascension? And then secondly, what does the AU's inclusion in the G20 mean for the African peace plan when it comes to Ukraine? Is there perhaps any more levers that can be pulled there to make that plan a bit more palatable? I'll leave it there.
Wonderful. Is there anyone else from the audience? I'd like to also take this opportunity to pose a question out of my own interest. How can the EU and the AU leverage their respective strengths and capacity to foster greater collaboration in addressing shared challenges on the global stage? As you both have illuminated to us, there are these big tectonic shifts happening. And from your respective perspectives, I think it would be very interesting to hear your reflections as well on how this partnership can navigate this changing world in all of its different ways. And I think I would like to hear those two reflections, and then afterwards we can see if there's any other commentary.
Yeah.
I can go.
You go.
Okay. Great. Thanks a lot, guys. I won't use this just to extend my speech, but I'll answer the questions that you put, and also make a point that I wished I had made. Is there a future for the rules-based order? I think that's sort of the question that I feel at least hangs in the air. And I was trying to say that I don't think actually the U.S. is as interested in a rules-based order as we might like to believe it is. And I think China would also probably not be as interested. Any great power is looking for dominance. Europe is different from the U.S. in that way, and I worry that in Africa it's not understood. That actually we are in a very similar position when we look at this geopolitically, these tectonic shifts. Europe and Africa have a massive strategic convergence, because where the U.S. might conceivably manage this decoupling from China, despite how interweaved they are. Europe never can. That's why we talk not about decoupling, but de-risking. These jargony words, they actually have a real meaning in terms of politics. It means that we're looking for a more subtle reshift of the relationship. And I think actually what Europe is looking for then and what Africa is looking for are very similar. We're looking at ways to maintain our relationships to all important partners. And we may also be looking at agreeing on some of the old rules of the game that we like to keep, but then some of the new ones as well. And I think Europe could live with that, could live with sharing some of the privilege that it's had from the rules-based order. I think that'll be harder for the superpowers, harder to share. I think it's destiny. You asked a question about the G20. So look, the Europe's support for the G20, and this is actually something else the ECFR worked on quite a lot in a more discreet way, is a great way of trying to make parts of the existing system more responsive to Africa's needs. So that's the way I understand it conceptually. That's why I thought it was a good idea. I also thought it was very important because it seemed that it was an inevitability. It seemed that this was coming one way or the other for Africa. And Europe had supported it from very early on, and it needed to also be there working with Africa going forward. Now, for both Africa and for Europe to benefit from this G21 seat, Africa has some responsibility here too. It's really difficult to represent a continent at the G20. And the only other part of the world that has experience with that is the EU. The EU has gone through a similar process. We have member states in the G20, but we also have the EU, it's a sort of shared chair. Now, Africa showed up in New Delhi without having quite worked out its representation, okay? It's still not quite clear. Is it going to be just the AU rotating chair? That's a state. Or will there be something else staffing it? Sort of Sherpa or structure. And that's so important. So I think without that structure, Africa's representation there will not be as strong as it could be. You know some of the weaknesses of the African Union structure. You rotate every year. You have to run your country as a state chair and then try to master all of the topics of Africa as well, and do that with a bureaucracy that's a little bit thinner than others. So the African Union is going to really need to bulk out some kind of secretariat function so that it can represent the continent and then play a fully active role at the AU. And I think Europe has an interest in working with Africa on that. Because without Africa being able to strongly represent itself, I worry that at the G20, it's just going to be pulled here and there, right? You'll have a state representative who's just not fully prepared. The African Union, you can go once to the G20 and not be prepared. But the next one, it's not going to be easy. There are going to be questions coming to it, not just about what does Africa want for Africa. It's going to be what does Africa want on these global issues, okay? It's a real challenge, and I think this is something that's so important for Africa to grapple with, and something again where Europe, not just out of obligation or solidarity, but in the interest of looking for common agendas, we need to explore with Africa. We can't take it for granted that we can form at the G20. Should be totally invested in. Be very important.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I also understand that, as I touched on, that the African Union is not quite up to speed. Look, you could say that it's not also quite a member. So it attended this virtual summit as a kind of an imminent member, but it is showing signs of, as you said, of not being quite clear in its own mind about how this representation will work. So that needs to be addressed pretty quickly. On your question about whether AU and the G20 will be able to contribute to Ukraine peace. I think that in spite of the fact that Ukraine has popped up and so on, as I understand it, the G20 doesn't explicitly deal with security issues. So, what's basically sort of been happening, the African Peace mission after Ramaphosa met Zelensky in Kyiv earlier this year has been kind of, to some degree, absorbed in Ukraine's own peace formula. So what happened, although there's not complete clarity from both sides about how this should be articulated, but so the issues that the African Peace Mission had, which was like returning of the children, exchange of prisoners, and the resumption of the grain initiative, have been kind of assigned to South Africa and other countries within the wider Ukrainian peace process.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have a few more minutes left. I'd like to ask if there's anyone else in the crowd that have some burning questions. Otherwise, it can always be discussed during lunch. Wonderful. I would invite our panelists to just make a few concluding remarks, and it would be interesting if you could also perhaps reflect on, as these geopolitical landscapes continue to shift, what are the areas of mutual interest for the EU and the AU within the space that could also lead to future conversations and collaboration? Very interested to hear that from your side as well.
Go. I think that the area for the greatest potential in the Africa-Europe relationship is what I described here, these changes in global order. And neither side is recognizing them for what they are, and that's why we're letting this go by. Europe needs a third way. We can give it, as we have, a nice kind of jargony chapeau of strategic interdependence. But what's just really clear for Europe is that it is not in Europe's interest to join one bloc or the other in a duopoly kind of situation, right? So that's choice one. Choice two. That means that Europe needs to go for a third way. If we realize that as Europe at a deep strategic level, and we use that to lead in our conversation on the strategic relationship with Africa, maybe it will become a strategic relationship rather than a list of projects, some of them serving European interests, some of them serving mutual interests, some of them not serving interests. Some of them are a hangover from a time when we were driven more by, I would say, normative things, obligations and charity, and things that we all want to get away with, I think, on both sides of the relationship. So although superficially we have a lot of differences, if we look at this aspect, which is very important about changing global order, we're in the same starting place. And where we go from there, that's up to us. But if you don't know where you are, it's pretty hard to figure out where you're going. Someone will just say, you don't get there from here. Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I mean, what I was trying to say earlier is that we have to recognize, and I think at a certain level of abstraction, a recognition that, you know, that whatever order that you wish to participate in, you know, has its downside, you know, and that you need to be very concerned that you're not becoming the vehicle of as you abandon the so-called Western hegemony, that you're not becoming, you know, the vehicle of somebody else's interest. I mean, we saw at the BRICS summit this last year quite an interesting amount of tension between China and India, for example, both of which, although this is never going to be, you know, explicitly articulated, both of which seem to be seeing themselves as being the authentic, you know, champion of the global South. So, you know, this is, you were referring, I think, to that too, like the danger that if you don't articulate your own interests, that you become the kind of passive subject of, passive object of other people's interests. So I think it's very important for, and even on the issue of, I mean, I don't think, I'm not saying the same thing as being just completely non-aligned, because I do believe that on these issues like Ukraine and so on, you know, that Africa should take its position relative to its own values and not automatically kind of disavow opinions because they're seen as being, you know, the expressions of some kind of neo-colonial or neo-imperialist positions of dating back to, you know, the Soviet era of the Cold War, which we're no longer in. So thanks for this. You know.
Thank you so much to our panelists. It was sincerely appreciated, and I think these reflections are also paving the way forward for us to always take a forward-looking position towards these issues and also see potential and not just challenges. I'd like to thank them with a round of applause. And now Priyal will quickly do some closing remarks, and then we can all have lunch. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining.
Thanks, Jana, and thanks once again to the panelists and the embassy for co-convening this event with us. I thought I'd close today's discussion maybe just with a short anecdote. About 10 years ago, in 2014, I was privileged enough to spend a few weeks in the European Quarter in Brussels as part of a African Union Commission study by the then chairperson of the AU Commission, Dr. Dlamini Zuma, who was the former chairperson of the Commission, to look at the institutions, the structures of the European Union, and contrast these with their respective AU analogs, basically. So looking at the European Commission, the Council, the Parliament, the courts, the External Action Service, and so on, and try and form a few connections with what we have in Africa. So, I went to Brussels thinking we're going to have this very dry kind of study in which we're looking at institutional interfaces and processes, the bureaucracy, this intimidating bureaucracy that they have. And, the weeks that we spent there, I was incredibly struck by the topic of conversation with European policymakers, European bureaucrats and administrators based in Brussels, was almost always about this kind of very deep personal connection that they had to this European project and this kind of coalescing European identity and what it means to them. And it came, this memory was jogged by your choice of words about sentimentalities that Europeans may have about the rules-based order. And it just, reminded me of that, because when I came back from Brussels, I always thought, as Africans, we definitely have an idea of Europe. We have an idea of what European priorities are and what's important to Europe. But we really don't have this kind of human understanding at a human level on, normative values, shared priorities that are expressed through these institutions. And I think it's important for us to remember that ultimately, at the end of the day, the African Union, the European Union, as large bureaucratic institutions, we often forget that they are human organizations. They are made up by humans. And I think these kinds of dialogues that we have remind us that, sitting in all of these fancy offices all over the world are human beings. And we need to understand each other at that level in order to have a meaningful conversation on these big global issues relating to climate change and migration and so on. And I think, again, this kind of dialogue that we had today is very important, and for us to maintain these kinds of dialogues is incredibly important. So, colleagues, with that being said, I'd like to once again thank the panelists, thank the embassy for supporting us today. And for our online audience, thank you so much for joining in and posing your questions. With that being said, I'd like to call this dialogue to a close, and of course, welcome all of our in-person attendees to join us outside for lunch. Thank you very much.